All right, welcome to tonight's class. We are starting a new mini-series based on the next 3 chapters of Tanya. A lot of times these chapters are grouped together about particular topics. And as was mentioned, in the email, is that we're going to talk about Kavanah. Kavanah is a Hebrew word which is typically used for, like, people use it colloquially. I prayed, let's use it in a sentence. I prayed with a lot of Kavanah. I prayed with a lot of heartfelt intention. That's typically the way it's used in Judaism. But we're going to learn over the next few weeks, there's different levels of Kavanah. And why is that so important? So I just want to explain how we got here in our topic. We spent the last 3 weeks talking about why action. In Judaism, the mitzvahs are, the primary part of them is the action. Is that they are, there's a physical thing being used, that a physical person with physical energy is being expended to use it. And with all that, we're changing the physical world. I mean, that was God's main purpose to change it, for creating the entire cosmos, is that the physical world, a place where God is hidden, because everything in this world goes through a filter of klipat noga. We call the filter of it goes through, at the very least, a filter of a translucent shell that blocks out the physical beings, people and things, from realizing how they're an emanation of their source, of God, of godly light. It's blocked out as a filter. But God wanted that because now, in a place of darkness, we can do, as they say, an inside job as being part of the darkness, or being, affected by it, by the filter that blocks out God's light. We can, in that darkness, transform it to light. And that's done primarily, we spoke about, with physical mitzvahs. And we ended off that charity is said to be in the Talmud equal to all the mitzvahs, is the quote. Because when you give $10 to charity, it exemplifies that premise we talked about, that the $10, how do you get $10? You went to work and you worked hard, and you couldn't just work for 20 minutes. You had to have a whole job to have any money, to have a responsible job with a paycheck, of which that you give that energy to God's will. So that's taking a lot of physical matter of energy and utilizing for God's will. Now, to segue into the topic of Kavanah, of why, even though action is so important, still Judaism says there's a very important other aspect that is also important, although it is different than action. And that is Kavanah, intent. Your thoughts when you do a mitzvah, your feelings when you do a mitzvah. Before we talk about that, in chapter 38, it segues into that. And it says as follows. It's interesting how there's a law, there's a halacha. It's a famous halacha throughout the code of Jewish law, that if you say Shema, if you think the Shema, you're not saying it, you're thinking it, then if you're saying the Shema, if you're just thinking the Shema, then you do not fulfill the mitzvah. Every day there's a mitzvah to say the Shema twice a day. And just one second. Just trying to make the settings good. It'll have to work. All right. Hamish tonight. No fancy virtual background. If you say Shema, if you think Shema, and you think, hear, O Israel, God is God, you did not fulfill the mitzvah of saying the Shema in the morning, you've said twice a day, morning and evening. If you just think it at those times, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah. And this applies also to other mitzvahs. Like, for example, when you say the benching, the Birchat HaMazon, the blessings after you have bread. Again, and other blessings that are even rabbinic, the Birchat HaMazon is written as a verse in the Torah, so it's a biblical mandate. But even rabbinical blessings, like most blessings are mandated by the rabbis, you have to say them. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech olam, and so on. And so too with prayer, right? The Amidah, for example. If you think it, you're not yotze, you're not fulfilling your obligation. On the flip side, let's say you totally spaced out, but you said it. You didn't think what you're doing. You're just doing it by rote. And you're saying the blessings, you're saying the Shmoina Esrei, the Amidah, then you're not, then you are Yotze, you are fulfilling obligation. But wait a second, what kind of Shema is it worth? You're not even thinking of the declaration of monotheism. You're saying Hebrew words by rote. I'm sorry, not the Shema, I'm sorry, I take it back. Not the Shema, the other things like the Birchat HaMazon and the prayers. Shema is different. You said Birchat HaMazon and the prayers, you're saying it, you're not thinking the relevance of it. And that ipso facto, as they say, in Hebrew it sounds better, b'diavad. Ipso facto means after the fact, then that is okay, that you did your duty. It's not ideal, obviously. You should know what you're saying. You should focus, but you did your duty. The one exception to that rule with verbal mitzvahs is the Shema. You would have to, if you said it without thinking what you're saying, you do have to go back. Meaning the other ones, like even the Amidah today, and even the Birchat HaMazon and all the blessings, if you said them by rote, you don't go back. The Shema, if you said it without intention at all, and just by rote, you do go back having focus, because Shema is, the rabbi said that's something that's so pivotal, you have to go back and do it. And what's interesting about that is that if you think about it for a second, that there's the speech and then there's the thought, the intention behind it. Why is the speech rule? So this is sort of ending off what we spoke in the past few weeks, that at the end of the day, the physical, whether action or verbal, moving the lips and the articulation, that is the main goal of the mitzvahs. That's God's main purpose. It transforms physical. Hence, that is the bare bones requirement. And also another important point he mentions is that, remember, what's your body categorized by? Mainly your action, your speech. The thought, although it does have the animal soul does have some thought, but thought is actually called in Hasidic philosophy, there's three garments of the soul, meaning three expressions: action, speech, and thought. But thought happens to be on a different playing field because your thought is it's like a attached garment. It's like just like your fingernails are like extraneous to the body, but they're attached to the body. That would be something more like thought. That it's not the soul, but it's very much united with the soul at every given moment, which is why we think all the time, whether we like it or not, because the soul is functioning all the time. And its united garment of expression, the thought, is thereby churning out thoughts. Speech and action are not as attached or as integrated to the soul. They're more external garments that can go on and off when you want. And therefore, your thought is more of a soul thing. Speech and action is more of a body thing. And again, the soul didn't come down to this world for itself, because the soul was perfect before it came into the world. And because it was perfect before it came into the world, what does it have to improve upon? More perfection. It's a piece of God. The answer is it came to transform the body, and through that, the body's sphere of influence. And that's why make sure to do, at the very least, the purpose of your souls in this world is to do something actionable or verbal. Okay, so now he starts the whole idea of the next three chapters. Even though action is key, Kavanah, your thoughts, your feelings you're starting with your thoughts and eventually your feelings are very important. In the words of a Kabbalistic text, mitzvahs, prayer without kavanah, meaning prayer that you're speaking it, but without having kavanah, which we said before is bare bones, it's considered a mitzvah, you did your duty, but it's like a body without a soul. And that's the metaphor he's going to use now to explain why kavanah is so key. He explains as follows. And this is a little bit of a mini lesson on the metaphysics of creation, that we spoke before. How does God create the world? God's everywhere. There's no room for anything else. And we said there's an idea called tzimtzum, that God contracts himself into away from a space, not literally, but figuratively, and that allows room for something else, of which then God emanates some light through in this empty space, through let's say a filter where the light is diminished and it comes into less powerful oneness. Things that are created feel more independent. Everything in the world comes from that. Everything is created by God's light, except everything in the world comes about through a different filter, a different level of filter, which is why things in the world are going to be a different level of life. In Jewish philosophy, typically they would categorize all creation phenomena in this world into four categories, four kingdoms. There is the inanimate kingdom, rocks, minerals. There is the vegetative kingdom, plant life. There is the animal kingdom, meaning animals of all types. And then there's the human kingdom, which is, it's actually the term for the human kingdom is not called Homo sapien. It's called, in Hebrew, it's called Medaber, the speaking kingdom, which is interesting that the Jewish philosophy depicted the human quality, the human kingdom as what? The speakers, the Medaber, the speaking kingdom. Because only human beings have human speech, which is a unique, although you might say human beings have, thinking, which is also a unique human abstract quality, our level of consciousness, still they picked speech as the main, I guess, chidush, the main novelty. That we can take that abstract speech, ideas, and actually speak it. That's a bigger novelty than just having the abstract consciousness. Okay. Everything that is created is coming from God's life, from God's light. So everything's coming from God's light, then the question is, why isn't everything the same? Well, everything comes through a curtain. Now, we can readily appreciate that there's a big difference from kingdom to kingdom. There's a difference of the of rocks to vegetation. That there's more life. There's something more alive about a tree than a rock. And an animal, even and a tree and a rock are both stationary. The animal is a different level of life force that's actually moving and doing things. But he says the principle, there's a difference of that. And everything we said before, everything that's created comes from that filter called klipas noga, the thing that obscures God's presence. It makes it feel independent. We call it in Hebrew hester panim, something that hides God's face. We'll call it hester panim from now on. So back to the question before, there's a subtle distinction between actually hester panim, God's hiding his face, and then tzimtzum, diminishing his light. The principal difference of those two terms, although they're both hiding God, is hester panim represents is downgrading the quality of God, the divine light, where the tzimtzum, where God sort of contracts his light, is limiting the quantity. He gives an example here in the practical Tanya that if you hide someone's face with a piece of black paper and it had a small hole in it, that would be tzimtzum. You took the whole person, you just put a small dot through the hole. You can just see a small dot of the person. It's the same quality, but it's just a small dot. On the other hand, if you took a piece of, let's say, parchment paper, and you can see the face, but it's all distorted now because there's an opaque filter, then you actually distorted the image. I mean, there's not even one dot of pure image. And therefore, everything in this world suffers, everything in this world comes through this dual filter, this double coffee filter. One is hester panim, saying that distorts the godly light that's animating it in a simply different quality. You don't recognize the light that comes out it's like colored light. It's a different type of light. And the other thing is there's also only a small window of that is even available to distort. So you're getting low quality light. That's the bottom line. Because everything's coming through the hester panim, God's hiding his face. in order to create a world of an independent, autonomous world. But there's different levels of how much of that distorted, let's call it low quality light, that you are even accessing. That's why there's more life in a human relative to an animal, or as the animals and humans have more life than vegetation, and vegetation has more of that low quality life force than a rock. And each one is its own hierarchy. There's more of a unique divine light or life force. Again, it's all distorted. It's all not the way it is in the pure godly image. And so he mentions in the note on the bottom, very important point, the inner reason why the divine light and energy in this world differs radically across the range of objects. Why is that? It's not only the function of an entity's ability to receive the light, but because the light emanates in its source at different levels. It says, this is one of the ideas of God's name, Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, that each one of those letters, if you think of a Yud is a dot. And then you have a Hey, it's going to the width and down. Then you have a Vav, it's all going down. And the last Hey, they all represent different levels of the source of God's, again, diminished light, because that's able to be a source for this world. It's giving different allowances for different species or different kingdoms. Okay, so we can, if we had to sum it up into two categories, you have non-movers, rocks and plants, and you have moving things, animals and humans, which are clearly alive and there's a soulfulness to them. Now we can understand, we talk about that a mitzvah or prayer that is done without kavanah, without intention, it is like a body without a soul. Meaning it's going to be like a rock or maybe a tree that it has no overt soul quality because of the mechanism, how God allows his light to be diminished in order to create different types of things. God is present in a mitzvah. Yes, he's present in the mitzvah, even if there's no kavanah, but it's a lifeless presence. It's not a soulful presence. So therefore, even though we're dealing with God's presence, is very much God hid his face. It's behind the screen. It's the wizard behind the screen. That's not a good example. I'm saying, but it's the idea that you're obviously going through a distorted filter. So it's a much lower level of light. But even that level of light, which is some type of emanation from the source, you can choose how much of it is going to be full force and how much of it will be not really felt, and sort of a rock mitzvah. So kavanah can be many things. It can mean intent. Here we're talking about the kavanah. The Tanya defines kavanah here, that you're being attentive to the mitzvah is God's will. You're doing it, the mitzvah is an expression of God's will. To attach yourself to God through his will. Because you could say kavanah means understanding the Hebrew words you're reading in prayer. But that's not really kavanah in the sense of having a spiritual intention. That's just a technical part of the mitzvah, understanding the mechanics of the mitzvah you're doing. But it's not a spiritual intention. So too, the kavanah with prayer and the Shema is that the kavanah we're talking about is you're having kavanah that I'm doing this, not just because I'm doing it and this is what Jews do, but I'm doing this as a way to connect to God because it's God's will. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. We spoke quite a bit in length about why action is so key. So why now is Kavanah? You're saying still you have to have Kavanah, because if you do the mitzvah, yeah, you did the mitzvah, you made a home for God, but it's like a rock. It's not a soulful, animated home for God. It's like a rock. In the parable of, we took a parable from another part of Kabbalah. It's like how God creates the world. We said God creates the world with this tzimtzum and with this hester panim, with this distorted, low-quality light. And still, even with low-quality light, you have more feeling of life and soulfulness or less. You don't want your mitzvahs to be valid but soulless. And we had a question, so let me bring it up. I'm not sure the question, Howard, if you'd mind unmuting yourself and explaining your question.
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't be clearer, but I was just wondering, because you spoke about thought and how humans we're in this one kingdom of speech. So the speech reflects what we're thinking. So what about our feelings? Does that make Kavanah is the reflection of feelings?
Yeah,
Kavanah, the way that is.
We're going to talk a lot about in the next couple of weeks, the next upcoming 2 weeks. Kavanah isn't just cerebral, like intellectual idea. It's ideally, it's actually with more intellect / feeling that generates feeling. That's the ideal type of Kavanah. That's real, authentic, feelings. And real authentic feelings can only, in Tanya it says, authentic feelings from God to God that are lasting can only come about with a preface of understanding, of thinking. So that's that. Now, okay, but it seems to be we're doing a 180 here. We're saying, mitzvahs action is so important. That's how we change the world. We're taking the physical, making it a home for God. And then it's saying, but it'll be like a rock. So don't do a mitzvah without kavanah. So I want to take a step back to a talk of the Rebbe about the parsha, the story of Korach. For those of you that are familiar with the story of Korach, Korach was Moshe's cousin, and he led a rebellion with other Levites and some other tribe people, saying, Moshe, you chose Aaron out of nepotism. Aaron should be the high priest. We should all be a high priest. We should all be able to do the most sacred service in the temple because we're all holy. And we know Moshe tried to get him to make peace and he didn't want to, and he insisted on a showdown. So he said, fine, whoever wants to do the high priest incense service, do it, but you're playing with your life. And those that did were swallowed up in the ground. And it was conclusively proven how Aaron was chosen by God. So the question is, why did Korach come now? This is later on in the desert. In the story, didn't he? They got the laws of Aaron last week's Torah portion, and Korach's story isn't for another book. So it happened later on. Why did Korach come at that point? And the commentaries talk about it, but the Rebbe gives a deeper idea. Korach wasn't an idiot. He wasn't just this rabble-rouser. He was a brilliant scholar, and he had a reason. He had an ideology of why he said every Jew should be the high priest, or why he should be the high priest, and others that want to be the high priest. He said like this, the story that happened before Korach was the story of the spies. The way the Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains the problem of the spies, where they went wrong, was the spies, they were told to go to Israel, scout the land, give a report of the best way of what's the best way to go up to the land and conquer it. They went and they got scared and they said, they didn't give the report of what they should do, how. They said, well, I don't know if we they started questioning if they should. And they said we shouldn't. And that was a big fiasco. They got all the Jews scared. They said, we don't want to go to Israel now. And God said, I'm going to wipe them out. And Moshe pleaded. And then God said, fine. I'm going to listen to Moshe's plea, but this generation will not go into Israel. They'll have to die out in the desert over 40 years. Now, that's the simple reason they were afraid. But Hasidism, like everything, gives a beautiful depth to the story and says the spies were brilliant. It says they were righteous people. They were righteous, valiant people. So why'd they get afraid? So it says that their fear was actually a deeper concept. Till then, the Jews they were doing Judaism all in the desert under God's supervision and providence. And miracles, frankly. There was clouds, there was the manna from heaven. And all the Jews did was basically learn from Moshe. They learned wisdom, Moshe, and through other scholars that Moshe appointed. And that's it was basically Judaism inside yeshiva. No worries. You're not worrying about making a living yet. You're in yeshiva. You're growing spiritually. You're learning more. You're deepening your connection. You're learning the mechanics of Judaism, how to be a Jew. And they went to the land of Israel, and they saw that it's a beautiful land, but it's going to require a new type of Judaism, a Judaism where God's not going to make miracles in Israel. They're going to have to make a government, and they're going to have to be an agricultural society. And most Jews aren't going to be living in the cloud of glory yeshiva. They're going to be having to make a living, and that didn't happen yet. That prototype didn't exist. They thought it wasn't doable. How could you live a spiritual life and yet be invested in a physical society out of necessity? And therefore they said this experiment, which again, it didn't happen yet. Now we say that's normal, but it didn't happen yet. All the Jews knew was Mount Sinai and God provides, and we learned from Moshe. It's a great deal. But then they said, we can't do this phase 2. It's not going to work. You can't expect Jews to be worrying about making a living in the fields and that's still having time and care for God at the same time. It's too schizophrenic, and we'll get swallowed up by this. I mean, the land Eretz Echelasi, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. Eretz Echelas Yeshva, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. It says in the Torah, and it means it consumes you. This type of life of being a Jew in the field, it consumes you. So he said that was their big mistake. And they didn't trust that God had a plan that you can even be a Jew when you have to have two extremes expected of you, of making a living in the physical world and still making time for your spiritual growth. And it was a fiasco. It was a fiasco that the Jews couldn't go for a generation to Israel, to the next generation was ready. So Korach said that story had just happened. Now was when Korach said, now I have a complaint. Till the story of the spies, of course I knew Aaron and Moshe are on a higher level spiritually. I mean, duh. Moshe was a prophet. Aaron was also a prophet. And he was one of the mitzvahs actually, some mitzvahs went to both Moshe and Aaron. One of them, I believe, at least one just to Aaron. These guys are on a different spiritual plane. How can you compare? Of course they're a higher level. Of course Aaron should be the high priest. In their level of their spiritual perfection. But now the story of the spies taught us that God ultimately doesn't want just a spiritual society. That's all it means to the end of what's the ultimate? A physical world, the land of Israel, that you make the physical world You apply the Judaism, you apply the spirituality. There's the physical application. That's the end game. And he said, wait a second. If the end game, the ultimate bottom line purpose is a physical land of Israel, meaning physical mitzvahs, then I don't care that Moshe and Aaron are on a different level spiritually. That's not relevant in the ultimate purpose of mitzvahs, the physical mitzvahs being done. The greatest Kabbalists and the Jew on the street who the Chabad rabbi gets to put tefillin on for the first time, it's the same mitzvah tefillin for that day. There's no difference whether they're the great Kabbalist or the Jew who put tefillin on for the first time in his life, doesn't know what he's doing really. They both did the same exact mitzvah that day. And that's what's important, said Korach, based on what God showed us by the story of the spies. Now I have a complaint. Now there's no hierarchy. Now all Jews are equal. On the playing field of physical mitzvahs, we're all equal. Aaron should be the high priest. I should be the high priest. He should be the high priest. Everybody should be the high priest. Or have access to it. So Korach has a good point now. What would you answer back to Korach? He said there should be total equality because in the physical level of mitzvah, everybody's equal. What would you answer to him? Okay, make multiple choice next time. The answer is, and this is relevant to our chapter 38, is that when we say that a mitzvah without kavanah, meaning with spiritual appreciation, meaning a spiritual kavanah, a spiritual intent, which again, how do we translate kavanah in this text, in this context? Kavanah is you're doing the mitzvah as a means to cleave to God. Kavanah is I'm doing God's will because the only way I can attach myself to God. Mitzvah, the connection. And there's different levels of how much you want to connect to God or feel that or mean that. Everybody's different. And Moshe, or the great Kabbalist, is in a much obviously greater thirst of connecting to God. Their kavanah is greater than the average person. And it says that a mitzvah without kavanah is like a body without a soul. Meaning, doesn't mean that not like that it's dead. We're saying that it's just like the body, the rock, the physical aspect. When a person dies, the body still exists, right? This is important. Just to explain what I mean by this. That when the person dies, the body still exists. Because the body, even without a soul, it still has a life force. The soul is the animating life force. But even without the soul, even after death, the body is still existing. How's it existing? Because physical matter has spiritual life force just to exist. The soul vivifies it, it animates it. So when you do a mitzvah, it's like a body that has energy. It's like a rock. It has life force in it, but it doesn't have animation. It doesn't have soulfulness. And kavanah is spiritual soulfulness, meaning you do a mitzvah, you put on tefillin, or you like Shabbos, and you now think what you're doing. At the end of the day, it's like a rock. It's like a rock. You created a physical, a spiritual rock, an entity. But is that entity, do you see how it's walking around? How it's a movable creature, you don't see that. You just see an act was done and you moved on. But if you had kavanah, you felt a godly thirst when you did this mitzvah. Now in godly speak, in spirit terms, it's moving around. It's soulful. It's animated. It's not just done. It's done with animation. And that's kavanah. And kavanah, again, that is obviously every person is different because it depends how much you can appreciate God and desire God and thereby connect, want to do things, do mitzvahs to connect. But back to Korach, he had a point. Who cares about Kavanah? I want to change the world. Who cares the intent? And this is what chapter 38 says and answers Korach, is that God, of course, wants the physical world. He wanted a dwelling place in the physical world. You can only do it with a physical body and with physical stuff in a physical world. But if you were just going to do mitzvahs in a physical way and not utilize your capacity of kavanah, of your spiritual thirst in the mitzvahs, you're going to make God a home, but it's going to be a dark home. Ever you go, we'll do mitzvahs, and ever you do mitzvah, ultimately it's for God's will. You know, like Zara, the Z. God was here. It's God's will was done here, but it'll be a world that it didn't show spirituality. And spirituality, I mean, godly spirituality, is soulfulness. It's another type of revelation. God wants a physical world that, as much as it can do with its physical, limitations, have some spiritual revelation. And that spiritual revelation, our mechanism for spiritual revelation, there's physical transformation coupled with spiritual revelation. And that is with your intent. You're trying to connect to God through this. You're focusing on that. And why is it important, though, for physical transformation? Because God wants a physical world that, as much as possible, with its abilities, to have spiritual lights all over on its level. If you just would do the physical, you're making a physical world that's, pledging allegiance to God, but it wouldn't show a vivifying soulfulness to it. And that is why we have to have kavanah. Meaning, it's not, some people think, why do you have to have kavanah in Judaism, in your mitzvahs? Why do you have to get inspiration? Authentic inspiration. Because if you don't have inspiration, they say, because if you don't have inspiration, you will lack motivation and your mitzvah performance, your behavior will fizzle out. But that's saying kavanah, meaning spiritual appreciation for God within the mitzvahs, it's not essentially important. It's just, if you hold like that, it just gave yourself motivation in order to get the job done. It's bad, and you want to have, some good motivation, or else you'll fizzle out. Technically, and this is a good point, I want to point out, I can give you very cheap motivation. And if it works and gets you to do mitzvahs, it's not the greatest, it's not the most altruistic, but it gets the job done. Let's say I tell people, do mitzvahs, because then, you're going to become the town scholar. Everybody's going to look at you. It's a pretty cheap motivation, but it works. And it's not but if kavanah is only to get you to do mitzvahs, then any kavanah works. But no, kavanah is not a means to just get more mitzvahs done. It changes the quality of the mitzvahs. Like we said, just there's less tzimtzum there. Everything in the world is created with tzimtzum, with God basically putting a paper in front of his face. And the tzimtzum, as we said is that God makes a hole, to show you, where you see a crack. Granted, God's, the light was distorted, but even the light that comes is going through a crack. The more you utilize whatever spiritual tools we have, kavanah, thinking about God, trying to connect and doing the mitzvah to connect to God, you are showing God in a very real way. Because if you do a mitzvah, you don't think about it, yeah, God will was there, true, but who thought about God? There was no God revelation. Kavanah is what makes the godly revelation. So it's not like a bonus. Kairach was wrong because it's not only about making a physical dwelling for God, it's about making a shining dwelling for God, a shining physical dwelling. And then with that, there is hierarchy. Moshe and Aaron have a different level of kavanah than Kairach. That's why it's important why they were the leaders and Kairach was not. Because they were the ones able to give that kavanah, that spiritual glimpse. They had it at a very high level, and they were able to give it over to the rest of the Jews. So the farmer who would go do mitzvahs, granted he's no Moshe, but he'd be inspired or taught by Moshe and get a little glimmer of that Moshe spiritual revelation within his mitzvahs. So kavanah is important because it's doing the ultimate goal of the mitzvah, making a home for God in the best way possible, in the most lit up way possible, which is, and back as an important precursor, Tanya is not a self-help book. This is not about you actualizing yourself. Maybe it will happen indirectly, but Tanya is teaching us the purpose of why we're in this world and how the best ways that we can effectuate that. Meaning, God created the world, God created us, God has a plan. Tanya is telling us what that plan is and ways, techniques, how we can live up to that plan at the greatest way possible. So it's God's agenda, not our agenda. God's agenda is for you to do mitzvahs with kavanah as much as you can. And then your mitzvahs are like a body with a soul. Not just existing, but existing with spiritual liveliness to it. Any questions on that? Okay. I want to just point out, this is one of the reasons studying Hasidism, Tanya, which is Chabad's school of Hasidic philosophy. Tanya is just sort of the core book, but there's hundreds or thousands of books of the later Rebbes teaching an inner dimension of inner stuff. Meaning, if you want some of this Kavanah stuff, you got to do it through understanding God as much as you can, understanding the spirit, the creation, the spiritual, the mechanism of it, in our place in it, and understanding your soul, understanding yourself. That is why Hasidic philosophy is so key, because besides the fact that it's a great motivator, the Hasidim are lively and joyous, but it helps you have the ability to have kavanah. You can say, I'm doing this mitzvah for God. If you haven't thought about God, you could say it, but you don't really believe it. You don't really feel it. The study of Hasidism is really to help us achieve this. And we'll talk next week about different levels. This is just the general idea of why kavanah is so important. All right, nice to see you all. Have a good week. And always sure to, any questions, you can email me, Tanya questions. We're going to do the end of chapter 38 and chapter 39 next week, talking the different levels of Kavanah. All the best.
Thank you, Rabbi. Fabulous class. It's so great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Good night.